talking computational photography with Jeff Carlson. This is MacVoices. MacVoices is supported by Kolide. Get important, timely, and relevant security recommendations for your Mac right inside Slack. Try all of Kolide's features on an unlimited number of devices free for 14 days, no credit card required, at kolide.com/MacVoices. Welcome to MacVoices. This is the talk of the Apple community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, today we're going to do something that's a little different, maybe not a lot different, and is not necessarily Apple specific. And that is talking about computational photography with Jeff Carlson. Jeff, welcome. It's great to have you back.
Oh, it's always good to be back. Thank you.
Well, thank you for doing this. This conversation was inspired by the fact that you are now penning is penning even a verb anymore?
Sure.
Okay, yeah, it works. You are authoring. There's the better phrase. You are authoring a new column on computational photography.
Yeah. So I started just before the beginning of the year. I started writing a column for Popular Photography magazine, which, as magazines have done in recent years, almost completely died, and then new owners came in and have rejuvenated it, and so now it's no longer a paper magazine. I think those days are probably over. But if you go to popphoto.com, it's got a whole bunch of new content, and part of that is I pitched the editor on doing a column just about computational photography and AI and machine language when it comes to photography, because I think that these technologies are changing photography in a really substantial way. Like, not just your iPhone pictures are better, or you can do some editing, a little bit easier, but in that sense that I think what we're seeing now is a shift that's going to be as significant as going from film to digital, or even maybe from going from black and white to color film. And I know that sounds hyperbolic, but it's really changing the technologies, it's changing the software, it's changing how we take pictures. And it's just a fascinating area that I've been interested in for a while, and now I get to write about, which is even more interesting because then I get to learn new stuff. And so I'm now writing a column. I should say the name of the column. It's called The Smarter Image at PopPhoto, PopPhoto.com. Comes out every 2 weeks, and it's been a blast because there's just so much to talk about.
So first of all, clever name. I like it. I like it.
Thank you. I was very surprised when that nobody else had used it. So snap that up real quick.
So the subject of computational photography comes up usually here on MacVoices in regard to our iPhones. And one of the things that really brought this home to me, I recently worked on a project with photos from 10 years ago, an event that we did at the office that I've used my iPhone every year, to take the photos with. And as I put the photos side by side, something you normally wouldn't do, I noticed that the photos just get progressively better. There is better resolution. There definitely, I think, is definitely better sharpness. And I realized that, okay, I don't edit these at all. I mean, they come out of the phone and they get published, and that's it. There's no tweaking to them. So my iPhone is taking significantly better photos during that 10-year run, and probably in the last 5 years was the biggest change as really the improvement ramped up from there. So computational photography, at least for the iPhone, in my opinion, is a real thing, and it seems to be, I think, a real thing for a lot of people.
Yeah. And let's not discount that you're probably a better photographer than you were there. So we're not going to put all of that on the hardware, but I know where you're going because there have been a lot of improvements. Now, what's interesting is relatively, although the hardware has improved in some significant ways, it hasn't made giant leaps. And that's sort of why we're talking about computational photography, because when you're looking at your iPhone, we're still talking about very small sensors, very small lenses. And with photography, the whole thing is capturing light. And that's why sometimes you'll have like a regular camera with a really big long lens, because it has a number of different lens elements that help uh, uh, bring in a whole lot of light, make sure it's not bent, etc. And we just can't do that on an iPhone because by nature it has to be really small. And also remember, your iPhone Pro, in this case, it has 3 different lenses on it. Well, those are technically 3 different cameras. They each have their own sensor. They have their own lens setup. And so everything has to be really small. Part of the way Apple and Google and other manufacturers have been able to overcome this physical limitation is in software and being able to maximize what it can do with the data that comes in. So computational photography will often talk about this shooting aspect of it. And it generally refers to what the software, what the hardware in your phone is doing to the image when it captures it. Because, when you lift up your phone and you tap the shutter button, in like the experience of it is pretty much, that's it. You take a picture, it records it, and then you can turn your phone over immediately and just see exactly what you got. But what's actually happening is far more complex. So when you tap that shutter button, you've got, instead of the camera recording just like that one little rectangle of light, it's taking like a dozen different photos in milliseconds. And each one of those photos has a different characteristic. So it's, at different exposures so that it can take dark areas and still have information, and light areas so that they're not blown out with, to complete white because it's so bright. But it's also taking into account like how much noise is in the image and correcting for that. And it's even doing things like recognizing objects in a scene so that your iPhone will know, this looks like I'm taking a picture outdoors, and these look like trees. So maybe we should make sure that those have a little bit more green to them, green saturation, than say this person, where if we have green saturation on the person, then that's not going to look very good. And it does all this in milliseconds, and it blends it all into an image that looks really good overall, and in some cases would be hard to get using a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. So there's a lot of complexity, and that's just on the shooting side. There's also a whole bunch of technology on the editing side that will help you, either do things faster that you couldn't normally do before, or just do things that you couldn't do, period. And so it's fascinating in that for a lot of people you're not going to really notice, but there's a whole lot going on. And I don't know, I think it's super cool. And in terms of writing a column about it, there's so much to talk about, from shooting to editing photos to even I wrote a column about just processing and culling photos. So taking all the shots that you took, say, from an event or a wedding, and using software, and the software will look at all those photos and say, this one looks better than this one. In these pictures, people have their eyes closed, so you probably don't want to use those. This one, someone has turned away from the camera, like all that kind of stuff that's enabled by this umbrella of computational photography, machine learning, all these technologies.
I'm glad you got to that, because a lot of us don't realize, with the advancements that have been made, that now the software can tell you things like the eyes were open or closed, and it has the ability to pick some of those things out. But I mean, in some ways, and maybe this is a stretch, is it fair to say that we've had computational photography of a kind for a long time, given that Photoshop was taking your images and manipulating them, maybe not quite as smartly as it can now, and some of the other software can now, but the classic Playboy centerfold airbrushing, was comes to mind. That was so extreme by today's standards, but at the time it was small miracles happening.
Yeah. Well, so that's a really interesting question, because I think technically, something like Photoshop, you are technically using a computer to manipulate photos. But a lot of what we're talking about now is how the software understands what it's seeing. And so, with say retouching, a lot of different methods exist in Photoshop that would require you to make different layers, and you have to make masks, and you want to adjust a person's face. You want to maybe smooth their skin, or remove some blemishes because you're working on a fashion job, something like that, or even just to make somebody look a little bit more flattering. And traditionally, what you'd have to do is go in and do all of that manually, because you're just sort of messing with the pixels. You're saying, okay, like these pixels need to be a brighter shade of yellow, and these there needs to be less contrast here in order to smooth out this section. What computational photography is doing now is the software knows more about the image that you're looking at. There's an image that I like to use when I'm speaking or giving presentations about this, and it's an image of my wife standing in front of a field of sunflowers, and it's sort of getting near sunset. And if I were to just show you that picture, you would immediately, your brain would say, oh, there's a woman in front of some sunflowers, and it looks like it's getting towards sunset. The problem is, a lot of photo editing software would not see it that way. It looks at this image and it says, well, there's a yellow pixel, there's a brown pixel, there's a blue pixel, and it just sees this as a collection of pixels. And so with computational photography, what we have is the ability for the software to look at the image the way we are looking at it. And so it can look at that same image and say, well, this group of pixels looks the same shape that I know of to be a human. So that's probably a person. And these areas over here are green and leafy, so it must be some sort of a plant. And this is a flower that I recognize as a sunflower. And because that top, say, quarter portion of the image is clear and has these colors, and it typically shows up in pictures of people, that's probably a sky. And so it now sees that image not just as a collection of pixels, but as different objects. And when it sees those objects and it can understand what those are, then it can take all sorts of different actions on it. So, for example, let's say in that case, we want the person to be a little bit more illuminated, or we want to, smooth their skin a little bit, make them look a little bit more flattering. Then the software can say, all right, I know exactly where that person's face is. And I know that because that's a face, I know that there are eyes and nose and lips and, different characteristics of a face. So instead of trying to, go into Photoshop and build all those layers and, do all the different things that are required to make someone's skin look smooth, but also look realistic. So smoother and also look realistic. The software can just say, okay, I'm going to apply the skin smoothing, which is this effect that I know how to do, and I know exactly where the face is, and so I'm just going to apply that right there. And you, as the photographer, you don't have to make any masks or layers or anything like that, because the software knows, this is a face, and I know how to work with a face.
Today's Mac Voices is supported by Kolide. Get important, timely, and relevant security recommendations for your Mac right inside Slack. Kolide sends employees important, timely, and relevant security recommendations for their Linux, Mac, and Windows devices right inside Slack. Kolide is perfect for organizations that care deeply about compliance and security, but don't want to get there by locking down devices to the point where they become unusable. Been there, done that, and it's frustrating for everyone involved. But instead of frustrating your employees, Kolide educates them about security and device management while directing them to fix important problems. Problems like evil browser extensions that may sell the user's browser history. Visit kolide.com/MacVoices to sign up today. That's Kolide, KOLIDE.com/MacVoices. Try all of Kollide's features on an unlimited number of devices, free for 14 days, no credit card required. And be sure to enter your email when prompted to receive your free Kolide gift bundle after trial activation. That's Kolide.com/MacVoices. Thanks to Kolide for supporting this week's Mac Voices. So, what I guess I'm hearing, and it's encouraging, it's a good thing, that when I see different software coming out and saying, now with AI, now with artificial intelligence, AI, with machine learning, that it really is, they're not just slapping on buzzwords, that they really are adding some, I hesitate to say intelligence, but sophistication maybe to the software that really does make my life a lot easier.
Yeah. I think it's probably more accurate to say that it adds some knowledge that is based on, the way they make these models are they feed a whole bunch of images to the computer, and it starts off where you have people that are saying, all right, this area is a person, this is a tree, this is a dog, this is a sky, and then the learning builds upon that, so that as it gets more information, it can then tell, okay, well, this isn't just a tree, this is a fir tree, because it matches these characteristics that I know of that have been defined as a fir tree. And when the software knows about all of that, it's not intelligent. I think, actual artificial intelligence researchers they probably bristle a bit when AI gets thrown around. But it's a cool little acronym. It's short. It makes you think of science fiction. It makes you think of technology. I can totally get why it's used a lot in marketing. But in general, what it means is there's something where the software or the hardware in your iPhone is interpreting what it sees and understanding more about that image. I think that's a better term. It's understanding more, and then it can take action on top of that.
A classic example of how we're going to be replaced by computers and AI eventually. Maybe I hope not, but I mean, because you still, especially with things like Luminar, you still retain a lot of the creative control. If you decide you want to blow something out, you can do it, but it just this gets you farther down the path to a really good looking image.
Yeah, and one of the things that I like to bring up, because so many times we go to that, and in fact, I've gotten messages from people who are reading the column. There's one person who just sort of went off, and I hope that he got it out of his system. I didn't respond to him, but he was so upset that that these technologies were taking over some of the skills that he had employed to make better images. And, his whole thing was like, well, I should just throw away all my images that I've shot over the last 40 years, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I'm not saying that AI is going to take your job, but what it does is primarily, I want to say fundamentally, what AI can do is get rid of a lot of the drudgery and save you some time. So, for example, you want to, what's a good example? Well, okay, this is sort of like a low level example, but one of the things about taking photos is when you don't have enough light, you increase the ISO, which is the light sensitivity. And as a consequence, you end up with more noise in your image. And it's just been a trade-off that we've all had to make. If you want a nice clean image where something is, dark, right? You're in a low light situation. What you'd have to do is you have to put your camera on a tripod and set a long exposure so that more light gets collected by the camera and it doesn't move because you don't want camera shake or whatever. Now, there are tools that will use AI to get rid of that noise. And specifically, there's one that I wrote about called, it's from the company DxO. It's called PureRAW 2. And all it does is take your RAW file and basically process it before you edit it. But if you have really noisy low light images, it knows because of the camera that it was shot with and the lens that it was shot with and how digital noise tends to manifest itself in images, it can use machine learning, computational photography. It can use these technologies to remove that noise and do it in such a way that it's not just, arbitrarily smoothing everything. Because the problem with a lot of noise reduction tools will be, it gets rid of the noise, but everything gets kind of smeary, right? Well, it knows more about what it's looking at. So it knows, all right, this is a really noisy spot, but this is clearly, the intersection of, say, the side of a building. And so it knows that maybe that needs to be sharper. And whereas, like a section of the sky can just be more, smoothed because it's just an open sky. And so knowing how to do that means that I can go and shoot at a high ISO in a dark situation. And I know that I'm going to get a noisy raw image, but I can fix that and deal with it so it doesn't look like I shot at a high ISO. And so I end up with a cleaner file that I can then edit. So that's just, one other example of, how if I had tried to do that same thing without this tool, I could do it, but I would have to make compromises. I would get a softer image, or maybe I wouldn't even use that image at all because it was too noisy. And so a lot of these things are getting rid of some of the drudge work. The biggest thing, I think, like, for example, if you use Lightroom is great because you can take an entire image and make edits to the entire image. You increase the exposure of shadows, or you add contrast or whatever. But what it doesn't do is let you accurately target specific areas. You can make gradients that will, like, you can make a big sort of radial blob and set that area to be a little bit brighter, for example. But in the past, if you wanted to do something more specific, you'd have to send it to Photoshop, and then you're dealing with layers and masks. And if you've ever had to make masks when you are working with editing photos, sometimes it can be really easy, but you have to make a selection. And if you're doing a mask of a person, and if they have hair that doesn't go in, nice smooth areas, then, it's hard to mask that hair. And, you're looking at, I don't know, 10, 30, 60 minutes of work just to get to that point. Well, Lightroom and Lightroom Classic now have a feature, this is also in Photoshop, where if you have a picture of a person and that person just needs to be a little bit brighter, you want them to look like maybe you shot it with a flash and you didn't have a flash, or they're standing in shade and you want them to just pop a little bit more from the background. You literally click a button that says select subject, and the software knows, based on what it knows about photos, what the subject is. In this case, it would be like, oh, there's a person roughly in the middle of the frame taking up most of the image. That must be the subject. And it does a really good job. So you can click select subject and then just increase the exposure on that person. And it took you, 30 seconds, maybe 60 seconds to do that. And so now you have more time to either work on more images or, you're done for the day and you can go have dinner. So it's a lot of those kind of getting rid of the grunt work and making things possible that are otherwise difficult, where AI is really, really helping and, changing photography.
Well, in your example, though, I mean, it also sounds like there are kind of three tiers to this. First of all, for the average user, it's just going to make their photos look better quasi automatically. For the more professional folks, it eliminates the drudgery of trying to get photos to a certain level before you start to apply your talents. But the third thing I heard in there is that it also might give you the ability to take a photo that you would ordinarily not have used, either because it was just so bad that it couldn't be fixed by human hands, or that you just absolutely would not have taken the time. And so, it is adding to what you are able to do, what you're able to rescue from maybe a bad shot or two that, depending on what it is. I mean, if it's a wedding or if it's one of those once in a lifetime events, you want it to be the best it can be.
Yeah, and it actually, like, that's a really good example because, the picture that I mentioned that has, my wife standing in front of a field of sunflowers, I had to pretty drastically underexpose that so that the sky wouldn't just be blown out to white. And so the original image, like, she is really mostly in shadow. You can't really tell. I mean, you can tell that it's sunflowers, but they're also really dark. And normally I probably would have just skipped right past that, except that was the shot where I felt that she had the best expression on her face. Like, she had this, sort of wry smile that was like, I'm enjoying this, but there's also a little bit of, are we done taking the picture now, that I found sort of funny, which as photographers, we know that look. But, like, sometimes that one shot that has the best version of the person that you're shooting may not have come out so well in terms of like the technical aspects of the image. And so I was able to, use some, just regular processing because it was a raw file. There's a lot of data there. I edited this in Luminar. That let me bring up the exposure and make her a little bit more visible, allowed me to take the greens of the leaves and the stalks of the sunflowers and make them a little bit more green, but also then to be able to do a little bit of facial correction so that her eyes could be a little bit more visible and, lighten her face a little bit more, again, without having to do layers and all of that. And so, there are definitely, and actually, the PureRAW that I was talking about, I shot an event a few weeks ago where I was taking pictures of speakers and sessions and attendees, and it's a situation that's really difficult for cameras because, you've been to conferences. They're usually in hotels. They're indoors. It's all, the rooms are dark because they, need to focus on the speaker. And so just by definition, I'm shooting at a high ISO so that I can get plenty of image data, but the shots just tend to be noisier. And that's always been a struggle. Well, I didn't worry about that this time. Even I was shooting at ISO 3200, maybe even 6400, which tends to make really noisy images. But I knew that the ones that I picked, I would go through that day's shots and pick out 15 or 20 keepers that I could send to the conference organizers. Running those through DxO PureRAW, clean them up dramatically. That could happen while I was, getting a snack or making myself coffee or something. And it made a huge difference in the quality of those images that I was able to deliver without having to go in and mess with all the denoising and the color denoising sliders and all of that.
Jeff is back in the next edition of MacVoices to talk more about computational photography, especially in some places you might not exactly expect to find it. That's next time on MacVoices. I hope you'll join us. Until then, and as always, I'm Chuck Joyner. Thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for show notes and to connect with Chuck on social media. Get involved in our Facebook group or like our Facebook page, and get more out of your Apple tech with MacVoices Magazine, free on Flipboard and on the web. And if you find value in it all, consider supporting us through either our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/MacVoices or by making a one-time donation via the PayPal link on our front page and in the show notes of each episode. You will join these fine people who help bring you MacVoices. Advertising handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CacheFly at cachefly.com.